Globally, we now consume 4 billion tonnes of oil every year. Oil spills from shipping accidents and offshore blowouts are rare, but when they happen, the impact on the environment, on livelihoods, and on the local economy can be severe. In this series, we'll be asking the key questions. What issues do we need to consider? What expertise and techniques are available? And how do we deliver a well-planned and executed response to minimise impact?
When there's a spill at sea, there's the opportunity to reduce the amount of oil which reaches the shore. But to be successful in limiting the damage, you need to be prepared and act fast.
In this programme, we're going to be looking at different strategies for response at sea, including the use of dispersants and in situ burning. But first, let's look at what's often regarded as the ideal response: containment and recovery.
Containing and recovering the oil while it's in the water is an attractive proposition because the oil is removed from the marine environment. But it's challenging. Oil's natural tendency is to spread out quickly, and it can cover many square kilometres in just a few hours. Plus, the oil weathers at sea, so its properties change. And all this means there's just a narrow window of opportunity in which to act.
To contain and recover a spill, we have a number of techniques available. But it's all about getting the right tools for the job to the right place as quickly as possible.
In the event of an incident, time is critical. That's why in specialist centres like this one, the equipment needed following a spill is packaged up and ready to go. These pallets have already been cleared by customs so they can be transported anywhere in the world without delay.
But there's no point having equipment if you don't know how to use it. We need teams who know what they're doing, led by people with the necessary skills and experience to manage them effectively. I've travelled to Ferrol in northern Spain to catch up with an oil spill response team from the European Maritime Safety Agency. These standby vessels are in place to top up pollution response capacities of the EU member states. They practice regularly so that when a spill occurs, they're ready for action. This commercial vessel is also fitted with an array of specialist equipment. Thanks to an arrangement with the owner, it can be mobilised within 24 hours of an incident.
Just how well equipped is this vessel?
Yes, this vessel has what we call state-of-the-art equipment. We have booms, skimmers, and we have the sweeping arms. In a real spill, I would say 50% of the equipment you don't need. But if you can tell me on the next spill which equipment I need, you get a contract with me.
I see.
In principle, booms act as floating barriers, either to contain oil near to the source of the spill or to deflect it away from sensitive resources. There's a wide range of booms for different circumstances. Lightweight, inexpensive booms with solid flotation can be manually deployed in harbours, but offshore we need larger specialised units deployed from cranes and reels and then towed, and this takes practice.
When would you use this? When's the ideal opportunity to deploy the boom?
I would recommend that we use these booms in normal weather conditions like this, and if we have a thin oil layer, then it gives us the opportunity to collect more, to collect it into the apex. And then we will deploy one of these high-capacity skimmers in the center, and then we can recover.
Booms need to be towed slowly and not deployed in areas with fast-moving currents. More than 0.7 knots at a right angle and they'll begin to fail. And they're also a limited resource, so not all sites can be protected. Therefore, it's important to set priorities as part of contingency planning. Skimmers also come in all shapes and sizes for dealing with different oil types and conditions, inshore and offshore. Nevertheless, the principle is the same. They need to recover oil from the sea surface while minimizing water intake. Weir skimmers often have a floating collar, which in relatively calm waters enables oil recovery with as little water as possible. Oleophilic skimmers are made of material which attracts oil rather than water. The oil sticks to the surface and then is scraped or squeezed off into a sump where it's pumped for storage. In the right conditions, the boom-skimmer combination can be very effective, but it does have its limitations.
It is not so easy to operate it because you have two vessels, and that makes it difficult because then you have to move in formation. Both vessels have to make the same curve at the same time, and taking into account wind, current and all the other issues. However, it is not going to the moon. Fishermen can do it. If you practice a little bit, we can manage it.
What's more, even the most sophisticated skimmers can struggle to pump very viscous, weathered oil, and in such situations, we may still use mechanical grabs. Another option for containment and recovery is to use rigid sweeping arms which guide floating oil towards an integrated pump.
The biggest advantage is, from my point of view, it's first safe. You can use it in rough weather conditions. You need only a minimum crew. And the other thing is, you are completely independent with your vessel. Therefore, it is especially used for rough seas, when you have only one vessel, when you don't have to mobilize the other ones.
Good.
Therefore, we call it is our primary choice of recovery.
During the Prestige spill in 2002, equipment like this was used to great effect. 16 specialised response vessels were mobilised, collecting some 17,000 tonnes of oily waste between them, and over 70% of this was recovered by just 2 vessels, both fitted with rigid sweeping arms.
Are there disadvantages?
Yes, certainly. The disadvantage is it's a heavy gear. You need special equipment, special cranes for it. You talk about 5 tons.
One major limiting factor for operations at sea can be storage. Smaller vessels with that much storage can be rapidly overwhelmed, whereas larger vessels like this with plenty of internal capacity can be difficult to manoeuvre close to shore.
One way to solve the problem is to use dedicated storage barges or inflatable temporary barges. But it's important to recognise that for all these efforts, it's rare to recover more than 10 to 15% of spilled oil at sea. When it comes to our next option, it's a case of weighing the potential benefits against the possible detrimental impact.
Dispersants, when used appropriately, can help reduce the impact on seabirds, mammals and sensitive shorelines. But it's important to be mindful of how it may affect the marine environment.
Dispersants reduce the amount of wave energy needed to break the oil slick up into lots of small droplets. They're sprayed from vessels or aircraft. The dispersant molecules align at the interface between the oil and the seawater, and the micron-sized droplets formed as a result are then diluted by the sea's natural mixing energy and degraded over time by microorganisms.
Dispersants can be sprayed from a variety of different platforms. It can be a seagoing vessel, or indeed you can spray from the air, from a rotary wing helicopter or from a fixed wing plane. Each of them have different advantages, they have different payloads, but basically when you're applying dispersant you can treat large slick areas in quite a quick time frame. So, spraying dispersant has many advantages.
To get to grips with some of the issues, I've come to Pembrokeshire in South Wales, scene of both a serious oil spill and also one of the most effective uses of dispersants.
In February 1996, the oil tanker Empress grounded just over there on the far side of the bay. She spilled 72,000 tonnes of 40s blend crude oil into the sea.
A major focus of the response was to spray 445 tonnes of dispersant, mostly from aircraft. First focusing on the freshest part of the spill, before moving attention to the larger, more weathered patches. So was this approach a success? To answer that, I've enlisted the help of Dr. Tim Linnell from ITOPF.
Tim, you were here during the Empress incident. Where were you and what were you doing?
Well, back in February 1996, day not very dissimilar to this one in fact, we were out there behind where the DC-3 aircraft were spraying dispersant onto the oil that was being, the freshly released oil that was coming out of the Empress.
Wow, so you're actually on the water as the aircraft come over.
Absolutely.
Is that a bit dicey?
Well, it might sound that way, but we were sort of well-practiced teams. We were used to working together. And also, I mean, the dispersants themselves, these modern ones, are formulated specifically to be, very, very safe. They're safer than the detergents that you've got as washing up liquid on your kitchen sink. So really, in terms of that side of it, we didn't have to worry about the dispersants. What we had to really think about was the toxicity of the oil, both for us, but also for the marine environment.
From being out there on the water, what did you observe?
Well, it was interesting. When the dispersant was sprayed on top of the water and oil emulsion that was forming, there wasn't an immediate sort of dramatic effect. But because we were out there, we could follow that over the next 3, 4, 5 minutes, look at the wave action, working with the oil dispersant mixture. We could see the emulsion started to break down, and then after about 3 or 4 minutes, you got that very characteristic sort of coffee-coloured plume that you look for.
The team continued to apply dispersant for 7 days and carefully observed the effects.
So what did you conclude?
Well, by being out there and sort of using the different monitoring techniques, we were able to see that the 445 tonnes of dispersant that was used was able to remove somewhere between 18 and 27,000 tonnes of oil from the sea surface and disperse it into the water column.
So even if you take the lower figure there, that means that each tonne of dispersant treated 40 tonnes of oil. This success story is partly down to the type of oil spilled, 40s blend being particularly dispersible, but also the oil spilling over a period of 6 days gave the responders a technical advantage.
With these sort of well-practiced and targeted teams, we could really focus on those patches of fresh oil to make sure the operation was as effective as possible. And really what that meant was that the 18 to 27,000 tonnes of oil could have formed a water and oil emulsion, and that would have increased its volume by 3 or 4 times. So we could have been sort of looking at 60 to 100,000 tonnes of oil coming ashore.
So it sounds like it was the ideal use of dispersant right here.
It definitely reduced the environmental impact of this particular spill because of the combination of circumstances that we had.
It's worth remembering though that the oil hasn't disappeared, it's now in the water column, and we need to think about how it might affect sensitive areas such as fish spawning grounds or aquaculture.
The dispersed oil from the Empress was particularly affecting the shallow populations of bivalves, the clams like cockles and other shells that are living in the sediments. They seem to eject themselves from the sediment and were getting washed up on the shoreline in very large numbers. The effects on other marine life in the waters were largely indetectable. Most species and habitats around Pembrokeshire within 5 years, mostly within 2 years, were back to typical normal levels.
But despite this success, it's worth remembering that the use of dispersants is not universally accepted. In many countries, their use is restricted or banned.
When they are used, even where they reduce the volume of oil reaching the shoreline, they can generate some negative publicity. It's important to recognise it's a trade-off.
In the case of the Empress, the sort of use of dispersant undoubtedly resulted in a net environmental benefit. But that won't always be the case. So if, for example, out there we had a coral reef, in that case, taking the oil from the surface and putting it into the water column wouldn't necessarily provide a net environmental benefit. Particularly if, as now, we've got this hard sand beach where the oil can be left on the sea surface, can come ashore and can be removed. In that case, you probably would not want to disperse it. If, on the other hand, here we were standing in a mangrove, then actually the oil would come potentially into the mangrove area and become trapped. And therefore, even in that case, even though you might still have a coral reef out there, you might want to disperse the oil because you'd reduce the chronic pollution you might otherwise get from oil being trapped within the mangrove and then being released over time. And so that's why it's really important in these sensitive environments to have experts such as those at ITOPF that can really understand the kind of sensitivity to oil pollution that each individual environment might have, and importantly to understand the response techniques that can work with those natural processes to sort of reduce that long-term environmental impact.
Making the decision to use dispersants is rarely easy, but time is an important factor, so contingency planning is crucial. And when planning, there are a few key things to remember.
First, there's a narrow window of opportunity. Depending on the oil's properties and the conditions, that could be a few days or a few hours, because once the oil is weathered, dispersants are less effective. Second, oil type is crucial. While light oils readily disperse, some viscous crudes and heavy fuel oils don't. And finally, the sea state is a factor. If the sea's calm, the droplets will float back up to the surface to form a slick. But if it's too rough and there's lots of wind, it can be tough to apply the dispersant effectively. There is an alternative to containment and recovery and the use of dispersants, which has not been used in many spill incidents because it requires quite specific conditions, but it can remove large accumulations of oil, and that's in situ burning. None of us can forget these images. The Deepwater Horizon, a blowout with severe consequences. But it's also a case where in situ burning was widely used. There were about 400 burns and they got rid of around 30 to 50,000 tonnes of oil. That's about 5% of the total spilled volume. Dr. Per Johan Brandvik from the Norwegian research firm SINTEF is going to talk me through how it works.
Per Johan, you've carried out a number of carefully controlled field trials with SINTEF to try and understand the main parameters for a successful in situ burn of oil. What have you found out?
In situ burning has potential to remove substantial amounts of oil from the sea surface, but it's important to remember that it's not the oil that burns, it's the vapors. So we need to heat the oil to create vapors for a successful in situ burning operation.
And then when it comes to how do you actually light this oil, how do you ignite it?
You can use a handheld igniter with a gelled gasoline, or you could use a helitorch hanging under a helicopter, dripping burning gelled liquids down on the oil spill.
And when's the window of opportunity? How quickly do you need to act?
When the oil weathers, the light components evaporate, the oil incorporates water, it emulsifies, and this makes the ignition of the oil slick complicated.
Yeah.
So we need to act quickly. In the same way as with dispersants, there is a time window to act within, and this is different from oil type to oil type.
In the case of the Deepwater Horizon, the well continued to spill for 12 weeks. That extended the usual window of opportunity.
What else have you found out from your field trials?
In these field trials, we were testing fireproof booms to prevent the oil from spreading and to maintain a thick layer, because a thick layer is important for the burning efficiency.
Right, okay.
So in this case, we had thick layers and we had an impressive burning efficiency of 80 to 90%.
So you say 80 to 90%. What's left behind?
You end up with a residue, which can be removed mechanically.
Of course, in situ burning increases air pollution, the impact of which has to be assessed alongside the alternative, which is the increased damage to the marine environment. It's a judgment call and will depend on the specific circumstance of the spill. We've looked at containment and recovery, dispersants, and in situ burning. But how do we choose the right option for any given spill? And how do we decide when to stop? I'm meeting with Richard Johnson from ITOPF.
So we've seen the options available, and I can imagine in a very short space of time, you're suddenly committing huge resources to a response. But when do you stop? When do you say enough is enough?
Inevitably, you'll get to a point where there's only small amounts of oil on the water surface through your clean-up endeavours or through natural processes. And at that point, you can be spending a lot of time, effort and resources chasing bits of oil, but actually achieving very little. And certainly if you've got the glare of the media, there's nothing better than having aircraft spraying dispersant or lots of ships with orange boom. But from our stance, technically, if you're not actually reducing the impact of the oil or mitigating the pollution damage, then they shouldn't be there.
It's important to recognise when to stop, and also to recognise that ultimately it's the oil type, the sea conditions, the chemistry, and the oceanography that really dictate what can be achieved at sea.
For example, if you've got a small quantity of non-persistent oil which is drifting offshore, then you might need to undertake no action other than to simply monitor and evaluate what's going on. Similarly, whilst it might seem counterintuitive, sometimes the best and the easiest option is to allow oil to come onto certain shore types rather than trying to mount a full-scale at-sea response in adverse weather conditions.
There are other times when actually you can make a real difference, can't you, by being very proactive?
Oh, indeed. I mean, absolutely, don't get me wrong. You have a spill of persistent oil in calmer conditions, and the ideal choice is to use containment and recovery. Alternatively, you could be using dispersants, and dispersants, are very good at treating a lot of oil very quickly, and particularly if you've got high energy conditions, high seas, where your containment and recovery isn't going to work. But you see, there can be an environmental consequence to your actions, and you just have to have your eyes wide open and be fully aware of that and understand that there's a trade-off. And this is something that we very often call net environmental benefit analysis, or NEBA.
Finally, while we should avoid using strategies which might directly counteract one another, selecting a combination of techniques on different areas of the slick at different times can provide the optimum solution.
It seems to me it's not a case of just choosing a type of response and just blindly sticking to it. It seems you constantly re-evaluate, don't you?
You do, spot on, yes. I mean, a good response very often needs different techniques, different strategies at different times, and that reassessment, that re-evaluation being continually done is good practice.
So this has been an overview of some of the options available. To make the best decisions, it's important to think ahead, anticipate the possibilities, and gather as much relevant information as possible. That way, if there is a spill, you can be ready for it.
And for more details on any of the issues in this series, have a look at the ITOPF technical information papers at itopf.com/tips.